Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It is an immense pleasure to get to present to a crowd as august as this. I was once a Ratio Christi chapter president, so I've been involved in this organization since about 2015, and I really love Ratio Christi, and I'm eager to present to you today about the importance of communication in apologetics. You see, each of us is called into the public sphere to present the gospel. And each of us faces our own Areopagus, our own place where we have to step out of our comfort zone and talk to people with a different worldview. And as a chapter president, I realized that this was a central challenge that I was struggling to meet because I had all these great philosophical arguments and great scientific evidence for God, but it was immensely difficult to communicate. I'll never forget the time I was at a coffee shop with one of my atheist friends, and I was trying to present the ontological argument to him, and it just kept on bouncing off of him. In hindsight, that was a terrible strategy, right? But it was experiences like that that taught me that what we're doing is talking to people. It's not just wrestling with ideas. So today what I want to do is to show you some ways to talk to people about their worldview and present the gospel in that light. And we're going to do that by quickly defining rhetoric. Then we're going to do a very quick read-through of how the Apostle Paul used rhetoric in Acts 17. And then we're going to do an exercise where we can practice for ourselves. So we sent out a handout that has some useful notes and jargon that define these terms if you need a copy later. But just very quickly, I'm going to define rhetoric and tell you what its component parts are. So rhetoric is the art of using communication to influence situations. What do I mean by that? Well, communication is the art of crafting messages, and situations are composed of three elements, all right? And this comes from the rhetorician Lloyd Bitzer. So Bitzer said that there are three parts to what he calls a rhetorical situation. There's the exigents, the audience, and the constraints. Let's break down each of these in turn. An exigence is what's called an imperfection marked by urgency. It's a problem, but it's not just any problem. It's a problem that must be solved, that something terrible would go wrong if it wasn't solved. You ought to be addressing this immediately. And in the context of Christian apologetics, it's the ultimate problem, our sins and our need for salvation, right? So, exigence. You always want to start with the exigence, identifying what the problem is in this specific situation. Next, you have to deal with the audience. The audience is the people you're talking to. But more specifically, it's a group of people who, if you persuade them, it solves the problem that you are trying to address. All right? And finally, there are constraints. Constraints are the aspects of a situation that limit what you can effectively say. This could be things like the audience's prejudices. You know, audiences come to communication with beliefs already, a worldview. It could include things like how much time you have to speak. It can include things like whether or not you have a microphone. All of these limit what you can effectively say in a given situation. And a good rhetorician, somebody who's excellent at communicating and influencing situations, is going to break down the situation into those parts and craft a message that moves it in the direction it needs to go. And I think that there's possibly no finer example of this than St. Paul in Acts 17. So now I'm going to very quickly run through how Paul used rhetoric to approach the Athenian culture that he was going to. And he also breaks things down into an exigence, constraints, and an audience. If you look at Acts 17, verses 22 and 23, you'll notice that Paul identifies an imperfection in Athenian society that he's going to try and remedy. he is noticing the idolatry of Athens. So when he is called before the Areopagus, this is the first thing he brings up. He says, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Paul is going to banish their ignorance of the true God in this speech. That is the exigence, the imperfection he seeks to solve. And his audience is the Areopagus. Now, I'm not going to go too into the weeds about what the Areopagus was, but as a kind of broad, rough summary, this was a group of sort of philosopher aristocrats who helped manage the city of Athens. And they divided roughly into two schools of thought. There were the Stoics, who were pantheists. They believed that the world was God. And then you had the Epicureans, who were somewhat agnostic on the issue. They thought if the gods existed, they just didn't really care all that much. So this is who Paul's talking to, and this combination generates constraints. One of the big constraints for someone like Paul is that he's used to talking to a Jewish audience. If he goes to a synagogue, he can whip out the book of Isaiah and start talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment of all these prophecies, but these guys most likely had never picked up the Hebrew scriptures in their entire lives. So how do you talk to people about something that they know virtually nothing about? Well, Paul looked at this situation and he crafted a strategy that allowed him to influence and introduce the idea of the gospel. And the way he does it is that he introduces the gospel narrative through the language of Greek culture. And he starts by appealing to that Athenian culture like he did when he was talking about how his audience is very religious. This was actually a kind of is a compliment to them. He is trying to make them more amenable to what he's going to say. And then he starts introducing ideas that appeal to general human reason. So you don't actually have to have read the Hebrew scriptures to understand these ideas. Anybody who's a rational person can follow the premises that he's about to introduce. So he says, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, He himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." So, stopping right there, this is mostly things that you can just kind of acknowledge. And there are lots of Greek philosophers who already believed this. They already believed that God was a transcendent being. But he also starts to weave in the story of the Bible, the story of God creating all of humanity from Adam and Eve, and that this is how he's going to work out his plan in history. And this brings us to verses 27. "God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far away from any one of us." Verse 27 is a blink and you miss it point that is actually very interesting, because there's a pretty powerful argument here that Paul is appealing to Plato. He's making an allusion to Plato. In Plato's Timaeus, according to a paper by Hubbard, in Plato's Timaeus, Plato references the idea of a transcendent creator God, and this was a very popular work in ancient antiquity. And Plato even says something like, "Well, we don't really know for sure. The gods are so far away, how could we possibly know anything about them? But we're going to try our best." He says something like that in the Timaeus. So Paul is actually turning that on its head. He's saying, actually, God is not far from any one of us. So that's going to sound familiar to his audience's minds. And then he brings in, so he establishes the transcendence of God with that. But now he's going to bring in the immanence of God by appealing to their own philosophers and their own poets. He says, He quotes one of their poets, "For in him we live and move and have our being." And then he quotes was believed to be a poem from Aratus. He says, "We are his offspring." So now he's establishing the immanence of God. And this is something that is not the case for either the Epicureans or the Stoics, because the Stoics have a sort of immanent God who's out in the world, and the Epicureans have a sort of transcendent God who is not concerned with the affairs of men. But Paul is bringing in the Christian God, the God of Jesus, the God who is both transcendent and cares for humanity. So then he moves into the rest of his argument and says, "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill." Makes sense. If God is this transcendent being who created us, he can't be in something we live in. He can't live in something that we created. He can't be dependent on us. This is just natural, rational thinking, something anybody who can think can understand. And now he weaves back in the Hebrew Bible's narrative. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So there you have it. Paul has used some Greek philosophical ideas and ideas from Greek culture to bring in a narrative that is profoundly Christian. And there's a lot we can learn from this. First, Paul's rhetoric is a model of treating his audience with gentleness and respect. You know, we always throw around 1 Peter 3:15 when we're talking about apologetics, but we don't often stop to think about what that means in the context of a given situation. I think that part of treating people with gentleness and respect is acknowledging who they are and where they come from, and being sensitive to that when we're speaking to them. And that's what Paul does. Even though he identifies the problems with their spiritual condition, he still takes to heart that these are Greeks, and they have a certain cultural background that he was going to use to introduce the gospel to them. Second, Paul was wise enough to craft his arguments around the constraints of his situation. Sometimes we are tempted in an age of social media to just try to bully our way through our audience, but you'll not persuade people by trying to bully them. That's not the way persuasion works. You have to work with the grain of human nature. That's just the way God designed us. Paul was savvy. He was working with what he knew about his audience to understand them and change their minds. Third, Paul's situation shows that actually using rhetoric is okay. Just like we wouldn't be afraid of going to the doctor for medicine if we were sick, so too when a person is spiritually sick, it's okay to resort to the quote-unquote techniques of rhetoric as a kind of medicine for introducing the idea of the gospel to a person or a culture. This is something God has given us, the power of language. It's there throughout all of Scripture, and we shouldn't be afraid of using that. But we also need to acknowledge the limitations of rhetoric and communication. Paul was actually a very good public speaker. If you read throughout the New Testament, I don't have time to establish this here, but throughout the New Testament, Paul exhibits the traits of being a trained public speaker. He does things like raise his hand as you would in a formal court style when he's presenting his speech to King Agrippa. This is the kind of thing people who aren't trained, they don't do that. Paul was an educated person, and he used that education. But even somebody as powerful a speaker as Paul was not universally effective. And this is something that happens all throughout the Bible. There are all kinds of people who are the most beautiful writers, people who speak their heart out, and they still fail to get through. The Hebrew prophets argued for centuries trying to turn Israel away from its idolatry, but they were ultimately led off into exile. Stephen gave the greatest speech of his life before the Sanhedrin, and he was still stoned to death. Just because you do your very best does not mean that you are going to succeed. And that's okay. Because even though you may feel that you failed, God is still at work. The Word of God says that His Word does not return void. And even if you can't see everything that you're doing and what the effect is, you have to trust that God is going to use it anyway. Because at the end of the day, the burden of persuasion is not on you. God is still at work. It's up to us to just be faithful to our task and do the best we can with the situation God has put us in our Areopagus. So with that being said, I just want to summarize very quickly what we've learned, and then we're going to jump into an exercise, all right? And I think this will be an exciting one. Just to summarize, rhetoric is about crafting messages to influence a situation that's composed of a dire need, an audience that you're trying to persuade to meet that need, and the constraints that limit what you can effectively say in that situation. And if you want to be a good communicator, if you want to engage the public square of worldviews and the people who believe them, you have to learn to analyze situations and come up with a strategy for addressing them. So on all your tables, I have written a note card, and it has a situation. It's got a person and their beliefs. And what I want you to do for the next, let's see what time we got, 10 minutes or so, is to think of how you would address this situation if you were put into it. And if you have trouble reading the handwriting, please reach out to me or one of us, and I'll clarify it. All right, so go ahead. All right, so time is up. It's okay if you don't have a perfect message crafted or anything. The goal here is just to get us thinking in these terms. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. What we're going to do is we're going to call on different tables, and somebody will need to tell us a little bit about what the situation you were given was, read out your card, and then tell us how you decided to approach this situation. And like I said, it's okay if you don't have a perfect answer. We're just getting started. Oh, by the way, all of these are roughly based off of real situations that I have seen and I have been in. So this is not like something I've totally made up out of the blue. These are people you will encounter if you do apologetics long term. So do I have a volunteer? Which table would like to go first? All right, let's begin. Please stand and...
I'm going to hand you a mic so we'll record it. So,
Jeez.
Here, just hold it. Just hold it. Just speak.
I should have made Caleb do this now. So our situation is Neil grew up in a broken home, now in college. He has fallen with the neo-pagan community, and he invites you onto his podcast, Return of the Gods, to discuss Jesus. So one of the ways that we were discussing in approaching Neil, one, just learn about Neil himself. Talk to him. Just have a conversation, how you grew up, exchange notes on your, how you were raised and everything. I was raised kind of in a broken home. My dad died, and I was raised in a single-parent household, so that's something I maybe can touch base with them. Then I was sharing with my group how I read a book by J. Warner Wallace called Person of Interest. And in one of his chapters, he does an analysis of some of the pagan gods, and they have certain attributes of God, but they don't have all the attributes. And it leads up in pointing to Christ, who has every single attribute, and Caleb was bringing up how he exercised power over those certain things where some of the pagan gods were limited. They may have power just over death or maybe just over the weather, but Christ demonstrated having power over each and every one of those aspects. And I think it was like 13 attributes. So we were discussing taking that route and discussing the attributes of these pagan gods to lead up to Christ, how he had all these attributes.
Yeah, that's great. Neil the Neo-Pagan was one of my favorites, so I'm glad that we got to start out with that one. For sure, I think that is an excellent way of approaching it. But the important thing I want us to think about here is that what would not be effective in this situation? Well, it's not going to be terribly effective in this situation to like whip out an argument for intelligent design. Your audience actually believes that God exists. The question is, which God exists, right? So that is a really good, important consideration. You're crafting your message around what your audience already believed, rather than trying to answer a question they didn't have. So that's a great way to start it off. Thank you very much, Tim, right? Yeah, Caleb, do you have something to add?
I had a thought also about the sort of constraints of the podcast environment and format, which is that like the bigger audience that you're dealing with is the listeners to the podcast. And all of these people are invested with respect for the authority of the host of the podcast. And so if you don't sort of work within that framework, you're not going to get through to the people listening unless you just really destroy them. But that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, that's great. That situation was actually based off of something that happened with Michael Heiser went on a neo-pagan podcast called The Voice of Olympus, and he was in that kind of situation. So that sort of thing actually does happen. So thank you very much for this table starting us off. Who would like to go next? Yes, sir.
I'll read the prompt and then talk about the problem, and then Jacob's going to talk about some of our techniques. So Lily was raised without religion. There we go. Lily was raised without religion, but she is exploring now. She likes the idea that all religions lead to God. She wonders why Christians can't be more inclusive of other religions. So we think the problem she's trying to solve, that we're not quite sure she understands the problem yet, but she's exploring because we all have that God-shaped hole in our heart. And she thinks there's probably some value or benefit to her from a religion. And so she's exploring in that regard. So how will we get to that?
Yeah. So I think that one valuable thing that we kind of learned from Paul is that it is important to recognize when someone's doing something right. And in this case, she's branching out. She's coming out of this, household with no religion, and she's looking for truth. And so, she's even asking, she's saying, like, she thinks that all religions lead to God. And so she's admitting, there is God, like, out there, and I'm trying to find him. But then she's getting confused and thinking that all the different religions can help her find the same God, which we can try to explain that isn't, the way to find him by pointing out, like, or asking questions like, is God, specific, right? Like, is he, does he have truth? Does he have, like, a personality? Because he can't be multiple things. He can't be simultaneously, not a God at all, that doesn't exist, like the Buddhists would say, and also, the same God who created the world. He can't be multiple. But we can, explain this, kindly and point out, like, hey, you are going to need to get to know him, and your reason that you want to get to know him and to draw near to him is because only he can rescue us, from ourselves. And then kind of, explaining how we've offended him and how we can only find salvation and grace through what he did for us, because we can't, do enough for ourselves. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah, do you guys?
Yeah, I think that is a really excellent insight there, is that you don't want to punish people who are doing something right. Paul commended the Athenians for actually caring about the existence of God. One of the larger problems in discussions of religion today is that there's a large swath of people who don't care. And that's even harder to reach than somebody who's invested in the conversation. So I think that's an excellent point. But in your particular situation, the problem is sort of a question of clarification. It's somebody who is interested but doesn't have the right categories, doesn't have the right ideas to properly explore that God-shaped hole she's feeling in her heart. And that's something that is happening more and more. There are more and more people who are being raised in non-religious households because of the rise of the nuns, and you're going to need to find a way to talk to those people. So you can't always assume that somebody knows what religion is. A lot of people are approaching this for the very first time. So thank you very much to this table. Do we have another volunteer? Yes, sir.
So, our character was George. All right. Our character was George, the post-humanist. He used to be part of a church, but now he's not part of a church anymore. He's a post-humanist. He thinks that Christianity has a legacy of environmental destruction, and he thinks that instead we should use technology to evolve into a better species. He's invited us to coffee. And so we had some things we wanted to ask him, some questions to help clarify and understand our audience. Our first thing we wanted to ask was, why did you leave your church? Is there like church hurt there, or was his church specifically harming the environment in a way that just turned him off and made him want to leave? That would help us as we approached him with more questions. We also know that because he was part of a church, he might know a lot about Christianity. He could know a lot of Bible verses. He could know some church history. So we want to ask, what Christian legacy of environmental destruction are you talking about? We want to ask, do you think that other ideologies preserve the environment better? Do you think that other ideologies that aren't Christian have done a better job of preserving the environment than Christianity does? For example, there are environmentalists who violently protest and sometimes harm the environment with the way they go about promoting environmentalism. I think we'd want to talk about that. And then we want to ask, do you think the actions of Christians negate Christianity itself? I mean, just because some Christians have done something that you didn't like, does that mean that Christianity isn't worth it? And then we want to talk about what makes nature valuable in the first place. What do you think is good about nature? Do you think it's beautiful and that's why it's worth keeping? Do you think it's full of diversity and that's why it's worth keeping? Because really, every argument for the goodness of creation also ends up being an argument for the goodness of humanity. Because from the Christian perspective, we are the peak of creation. Everything that makes creation good makes humanity even better. So if he thinks creation is worth keeping because of diversity, beauty, goodness, humanity is also worth keeping. And I think that's something we want to talk to him about.
Yeah, that's great. I really applaud the depth of that and your desire to dig into the reasons in the background. That's really important. And you're really integrating the two there, because you're not just interested in like the person's psychology. That's important. You're also interested in like the actual reasons for why somebody thinks what they think. And I think your strategy there is brilliant, trying to gather some information and try and understand the person you're talking to before you talk to them. And I think that you raise some excellent lines of inquiry. If you haven't read up on post-humanism, I encourage you to do so as quickly as possible, because I have been in a lot of graduate seminars. I am a PhD candidate in communication, and it's exactly this kind of argument comes up quite frequently. The argument is often that it's exactly because Christians view humanity as the pinnacle of creation that Christianity has a legacy of environmental destruction, because we feel like it gives us license to do whatever we want with the environment rather than properly take care of it. And that's why there has been some of a push towards more indigenous views of human nature that situate humanity as a kind of animal and just another part of nature. So that's something that often comes up these days, and it's important to think about that. Now, this particular example is a little bit crazy. I've not yet encountered a post-humanist who puts all that together, but I have run into an amalgamation of that kind of argument before. So thank you very much for responding to that. Yeah. Let's go. Let's hear it.
All right, so our situation is Alvin is a firm member of the new atheist community. He left the faith because his father, a pastor, abused his mom. He has begun releasing videos attacking your chapter, or our chapter. So one of the first things we want to do is reach out to him and invite him over to our meetings and ask him, like, why are you an atheist? What is the reasons why you're an atheist? And it could be like lack of evidence or anything, but we really want to get connected with him. We want to ask him, like, build a relationship. And if the reason why he is an atheist because his pastor, his father, abused his mom, then we want to ask him, like, well, does that represent Jesus? Does that represent Christianity? And during our meeting, like, we want to like let him like let it all out and address, like, yeah, what your father did was terrible, and connect with him that way. But yeah, it's his situation with his father. We want to address that it does not represent Christianity, and that it does not represent Jesus.
Daniel had a point too about the video. You want to talk about riding that wave?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So we were kind of talking about how he's going to be in a position where he's antagonistic for the sake of being antagonistic towards the or chapter, because unless there's some affiliation there, he's simply targeting it because of his hatred towards faith. And he's recognized that Ratio is a one that supports the thing that he hates, and so he's going to target it. And one of the things that you want to do is, where like Julian was saying, is going into that encounter and having that validation experience with him and getting to know where he's at. But yet if he refuses such a thing, we also have to take into account what is the effect of what he's proposing, right? What is the video? What is the opportunity that is put there? So it's kind of talking with Darren, and there's different ways to go about it, but it's kind of like an opportunity to not only use Ratio as a foundation to promote the Christian faith and like support, or in some ways, in his view, oppose what his claims are to be. And depending on the need for defense is the gravity of how you focus on that conversation. So just kind of working your way, not necessarily needing a response video, but finding a way to respond and using the attention to turn it around into something good, rather than using it as a opportunity to use your emotions over the glory of God. So I think that's all I had. Did I hit it?
Yeah,
Okay.
So by turning it into good, use that as an opportunity to invite all of the people that may have seen his video to your club. Say, look, you've heard some claims about our club. Come and see for yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's exactly right. So there's a bit of an inside joke here. At the Texas A&M chapter of Ratio Christi in our presentations, we often introduce apologetic arguments from the atheist side with a character named Alvin the Atheist. Okay. So I decided to flesh out his backstory a little bit, make him a more well-rounded character. And I also wanted to make the situation a little bit more complicated, because in this situation, you're not just dealing with apologetic argument, you're actually struggling with a kind of public relations crisis. And this does happen. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, I don't know of any particular Ratio Christi chapter that has been attacked by a new atheist YouTube channel or anything, but there are certainly Christian ministries that have. And the question in those situations is, what do we do? You know, how do you treat your audience with gentleness and respect in that situation? It's tough.
It is.
I really applaud your reminding us that God can turn what is evil into something good. You know, what man meant for evil, God can use for good. And I think that's certainly true in situations like this. In this particular scenario, you might have to recognize that you're probably not going to persuade Alvin. But you do need to consider that you're right, we could use this as an opportunity. But at the same time, never fully count Alvin out. God does crazy things in people's lives. This particular backstory is based off of a very sad situation that I ran into when I was sharing the faith back when I was an undergraduate. And an atheist gentleman came from a background like this. And that was actually the conversation where I was trying to use the ontological argument, and this all came up, and I left that coffee shop thinking, man, what a disaster. He was a smart guy, a really smart guy, and we eventually lost touch. But years later, he contacted me over Facebook Messenger and said, hey man, I know it's been a long time, but I'm getting married now. You know, I found a girl and I've started to explore faith again, and I don't think that I would be where I'm at if we hadn't had those discussions. So never count anybody out. God is always at work.
Stone in his shoe, right?
Yeah. And that's one of the powerful things about language. It has a sort of being of its own. It carries on and continues past the moment. You never know where the word will echo down and where it will eventually end up. It could go from his mouth to someone else's mouth to someone else's mouth and change their life. Yeah. The important thing is to keep talking, to keep sharing. So thank you.
We had an atheist club do condoms for canon. So they had a tabling event where they were taking your Bible and giving you a condom. Yeah, and that was like our second year as a chapter, and it wasn't an attack on us, but we thought, how do we respond to this? This is incredibly offensive. And so our president at the time, she wrote a little op-ed for the student paper and talked about how this really was offensive, and it was interesting that they chose the Christian Bible and not the Quran. And those kinds of things, but invited people to our club to kind of talk about Christianity from a non-believer's perspective, and so used it as an opportunity to recruit.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, you have one thing to say?
Sure. Another thing that about this thing that I think is important to emphasize is that, especially whenever arguments get heated, there's a great temptation to psychologize the person you're talking to. Let's say beyond a reasonable doubt that the reason why he's bringing up these things are because of his past. That would be a very hot nerve and not very sensitive thing to do, to bring up in conversation about him. Although, again, as things go on, especially if the conversation is not a good faith conversation, that can become a great temptation. And as we've noted, it is often the how you say things is often far more important than the what, and part of the how is, the what is part of the how as well. So it would be or one of my chief concerns would be simply being very, very sensitive. If you even do know that, which is kind of a question of like, how would you know that in this situation exactly? But I don't know. Maybe you do. Just being very, very sensitive and be very, very careful with that information.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent points. Now, I'm actually going to call on one this time because I definitely want us to get through this scenario before we leave. I want us to do Carl, the psychoanalyst. So that's this table right here.
I guess I can do this. Okay, please. All right, so we had Carl, and he's an enthusiastic new Christian, but everything he knows about Christianity came from Jordan Peterson. So we discussed trying to explain to him that while we agree that some of the things that he's saying might be, partially true, we want to ask what did the authors originally intend to say about the Bible, right? Because Jordan Peterson will do a lot of like psychoanalysts of the Bible and like, well, the authors, they were talking about like the ultimate predator when they talk about Satan or something, right? And it's like, well, no, these things there's different ways you're supposed to read the Bible and interpret the Bible, right? As part of hermeneutics. So maybe trying to explain to him that, this stuff might not be wrong, it could be helpful, but it's not necessarily how we're supposed to read and interpret the Bible as Christians, so.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because and it's something I don't see discussed a lot because like Jordan Peterson is hugely influential. When people talk about Christianity, increasingly they're like talking about what Jordan Peterson thinks about Christianity, and what he says is not necessarily reflective of Orthodox Christianity. So I think we need to be careful about that. But at the same time, it's an amazing opportunity because now there are actually people out there who want to talk about Christianity. So yeah, thank you very much for doing that. Now I need another volunteer. Oh, sorry, James, did you?
Yeah. So like one of the big things though, when it comes to like dealing with internet personality influenced people, is that you're gonna have to deal with like a lot of different arguments that may come somewhat out of nowhere and may be disjointed, like completely and utterly. So, like, might bring up something like death of the author or other sort of postmodern arguments. So I mean, in this particular regard, you'll just have to like sort of think on your feet a lot.
Yeah. So, thank you very much. I'm going to do this table next. You can do one or both of those.
We'll do
'cause they're both
both.
really good.
Got to do both because these people need to know we were a table of two given 2 things to go over in 10 minutes.
Blame Zach on that one. He gave you an extra card.
You weren't here. Don't act like you were helping us, Finn. So our first case is Sabrina. So Sabrina is an ex-evangelical who has a bad past with the church. She views it as a source of religious trauma. She is trying to entice people on your campus to join her student org, which is about witchcraft. So, here's our analysis of this situation. So, the first thing we agreed upon is that trying to have an in-depth conversation about religious trauma on the first encounter is not going to work because we're not trained well enough to do that. So we'd rather just try the first encounter or two to just be nice and friendly and treat her like a human being and not like some prey. Burn the witch. Yes, I've been told we're not allowed to burn witches in today's age. Very sad. This is what America has come to. And so we were like, yeah, eventually we can get around to the other stuff. Because at some point, it's clear she's going into witchcraft. Most people don't get into witchcraft. Witchcraft's a very particular thing to go down from a Christian background. Most people who are into witchcraft these days aren't doing it because they have a sincere belief in magical powers. They're doing it out of pure resentment against Christianity and based on a very historically suspect narrative of Christianity using the idea of witchcraft as a way to oppress women. And so ultimately we think that by going into the question of how much is many steps down the line when we eventually try to untangle Sabrina's religious trauma, we think that we can find within her enjoyment of witchcraft that it's not done out of discovering some new spirituality which the church was oppressing her from. We think we can show her fairly easily that this is just an outgrowth of her hatred, and no one wants to be living in hatred and relishing in that. And so hopefully we can at least show her that witchcraft is not a good way to be dealing with her religious trauma. And we might not be able to fix her religious trauma. We're not going to pretend that in our few meetings with her we're going to develop that level of capacity, but we can at least find ways to mend the symptoms, and hopefully she can come to interact with other people, maybe in a church environment if we're lucky, who can help her the rest of the way, because frankly we can't treat this as we're the only people in the world who's ever going to interact with her. And we'd like for more people than us, more Christians than us, to be ones interacting with her. We just want to do our part through what we can do from an apologetic perspective.
All right. Thank you very much for dealing with Sabrina, the ex-evangelical witch.
All right, and now here's the fun one. We got Bill. So Bill is a crypto archaeology fan. The biggest crypto archaeology fan. He's seen every bad podcast you can imagine. He watched every episode of Ancient Aliens. He believes ancient civilizations were in contact with the aliens, and the aliens gave us the Bible as a secret code.
Does he watch Billy Carson?
He is Billy Carson. His name is Bill. And oh no. And so our first thought was, well, yes, of course, everyone knows this. But so we think Bill is actually probably easier to get through to than Sabrina in a lot of ways. Bill is coming at us with a view of like Christianity is kind of true, but it's true in a way based on secret hidden knowledge that is publicly available on the internet, but you aren't reading. You know, he's been to the second page of Google. He knows things that you could not possibly imagine and whatnot. And so I think handling Bill is a lot more just, hey, you get like that there's more to this world than you might previously seen, but in fact it's a lot stranger than you think. Saying it's all aliens is surprisingly tame. In fact, this is not a simple thing of aliens and whatnot, creatures on this earth. There is, in fact, divine spiritual powers involved in this. And I assure you, Bill, that's a lot cooler and a lot crazier than any of your conspiracy theories. So, David mentioned over our first example, he had Michael Heiser go onto a pagan podcast, and that's basically, you think you're cool and esoteric, well, guess what? Christianity is much more cool and esoteric than you thought. And so I think there's a pretty nice cut-in you can go in on, like, actually, yeah, it's not that these were given to people by aliens, no. These were actually given by fallen watchers as described in Genesis 7. Well, the real story, we can go through it, and we just say, let's get rid of this alien talk. Let's move it over to spiritual being talk and see if we can out-weird him to the point that he realizes, you know, we are in fact exactly what we claim to be the whole time.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. So, I brought up, you'll find several examples of like neo-paganism and witchcraft and stuff here, because there's an increasing number of people who believe they have been initiated into some kind of esoteric truth these days. And this is a very fascinating phenomenon, and it's only continuing to rise. The religious landscape of the United States is crazy right now, and it will continue to become crazier and crazier. Right? There's a lot of great books out there. I encourage you to read them, because the nuns may be leaving organized religion, but they're not leaving spirituality. And the spiritualities they're going to rush in to fill the void of Christianity are going to be fragmented and far stranger than anything we've dealt with like the new atheists. And that's one of the things I've tried to hammer home today. For a decade or more now, our apologetics have been targeted almost exclusively at Alvin. But Alvin's not the norm. The people that you're going to be talking to mostly are all the different kinds of people that we have seen in this room. And the power of rhetoric is a tool God has given us to reach out to those people and bring the gospel into a dark and dying world. And if you just remember those simple rules about identifying the exigence, the need, if you think about your audience and you acknowledge the constraints that limit what you can effectively say, you will be a much better communicator of apologetic arguments. And I hope you take this knowledge with you back to your chapters and use it to spread the gospel. So thank you, everybody, for participating today. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to every group, but I really hope that we can continue this discussion later on. All right, thank you.